Before we begin, here's how to earn continuing professional education credit for attending this session. Gain valuable insights by attending the podcast, then complete the assessment test to download your certificate. To do this, follow these simple steps. Click on the link in your description to access the session. Create a free account and attend the podcast. After the podcast, take the assessment test and download your certificate. It's easy, and it's free. We highly recommend checking out our subscription. Let's get started.
I wouldn't deny that I have come across people also talking about that we don't do it that way. I mean, we don't really even need to know what the top brass has to say. At the end of the day, we just need to please the manager. Whatever the manager has put forward, we got to get it done. As long as you're getting that, you're taken care of. But that it's a crazy thing. But then I've also seen issues wherein the tune in the middle, they are the ones who actually prevented the ethical lapses.
Right. Yep.
There was a weak tone at the top, but the tune in the middle was strong, and that's how they prevented ethical lapses. I'm sure you must have come across that in your study as well. So could you just give me an example of this strong tune in the middle preventing an ethical lapse despite a weak tone at the top?
Yeah, I think rather than the example I'm going to give you is not so much that it prevented it, but that it detected it more quickly than it otherwise might have been. So I think
detecting would be better.
Yeah, so I'm thinking like with WorldCom way back in the late 90s, early 2000, that their fraud that was going on there, where it was the folks in the internal audit department who were able to identify what was going on with the accounting fraud. So it wasn't the top of the top of the organization was the ones who were directing the fraud, the CEO and the CFO. But it was the internal audit staff that was able to really get their hands around what was going on. So, and that was more folks in the middle. They weren't going along with it, right? I mean, the top of the organization said, we're gonna do this fraud. Obviously, we are doing this fraud, and they wanted to keep it going for, their thought was that they could ride it out, that eventually the company would turn around. It almost never works that way.
Welcome everyone to another edition of your favorite podcast we're trying to figure out. I'm your host Saul, and today we're going to be tackling a question that affects every organization from small businesses to Fortune 500 companies. Why do good people make bad decisions at work? Unethical behavior in the workplace isn't always a result of bad intentions. In many cases, people don't even realize they are crossing ethical lines until it's too late. And that's exactly what we'll explore today. How ethical blind spots, corporate culture, and workplace pressures influence behavior. Joining me on this deep dive is Andy Felo, Associate Professor of Accounting at Susquehanna University. Andy's research focuses on the psychological and organizational factors that lead to unethical decision-making in business. We'll explore the difference between tone at the top and tune in the middle, why ethical lapses often start small, and more importantly, how organizations can foster a culture of integrity. Andy, it's a pleasure to have you today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. And welcome to our viewers. If you have questions for Andy, please put those in the comments on LinkedIn or YouTube. If you're looking for CPE credits for this podcast, and you want to join us for future CPE approved podcasts on MyCPE1, you can do that at mycpe.com/podcast. And lastly, you can also listen to the podcast on the go by downloading the MyCPE1 mobile app, which is available on the App Store for the iOS users and the Play Store for the Android users. Now, Andy, your research highlights that people often behave unethically without realizing it. Can you share some real-world examples of how this happens in everyday business settings?
Sure. So I think what just in general, what happens is people are involved in their day-to-day work, their decisions, and that sort of thing, and there's pressures that they're under, and maybe, for example, that they're in a company, their earnings are not quite what they had hoped that they would be, and so they're thinking, okay, well, you know what, we've got a little bit of flexibility with some of the assumptions we make in accounting. Okay. For example, how long to depreciate assets for. And we might look at that and say, we're using, let's say, 8 years to depreciate an asset, but we really could justify making it 10 years. And if we do that, then that will reduce the annual expense. So we say, okay, well, we're, like I said before, we're not quite hitting the earnings that we had hoped for, but we expect next year will be better. So what we'll do is we'll change that depreciation expense this quarter. That'll help us get through this rough spot that we think will go away next year, and then that'll correct itself down the road. And then it turns out, well, no, it doesn't. Right? Like sometimes it works, oftentimes it doesn't. There's some underlying problem in the business that you can't fix, so to speak, with an accounting change. And then what happens is we get to the next year and we have the same sort of thing, and now we're still under pressure, and we're trying to figure out what do we want to do to try to rectify this. And we maybe make another decision that says, well, you know what, maybe instead of 10 years, now we make it 11 years. And then it grows to the point where maybe 10 or 11 years was justified. We get to 12 years, like, well, no, there's no way that we would use this for 12 years. So basically what happens, I think, is it sneaks up on people that they're just going their day to day, and they're just expecting things to be better down the road, and it doesn't turn out that way. And not only that too, but people like to think of themselves as being honest, ethical, moral people. And so they don't think about it as being a problem. Maybe they don't realize that it's an ethical issue until it's too late. And then they're so far down that road. It's like, well, we're down this path. What are we going to do to change it? And there are no good options at that point. When I say no good options, there are no options that will allow them to get out of it without some sort of ramifications for them, whether the company gets into some kind of trouble, they personally get into some kind of trouble. But we see it a lot with in accounting issues where, like I said before, where it kind of starts out small, and then it grows. It could even be on an individual basis where maybe you're having some financial pressure at home, and you look at you're going to maybe borrow some money from your employer. You'll be able to pay it back next year, and the same sort of thing happens. So I think it sneaks up on people is what the issue is.
Yeah, and I guess together with that, we're also going to be certainly touching on the workplace pressures as well, later on, because there is also a culture in itself, and you just don't realize it at all because everybody else is doing it.
Mm-hmm.
That's there.
Right.
I mean,
you're getting cues from your boss, or your boss's boss, and that sort of thing. And so maybe you got cues from your coworkers and that sort of things that we really need to get past this rough spot. You want to be part of the team. You don't want to be seen as an outsider or going against the grain, that sort of thing. So there's all kinds of issues that come up. It's both from an organizational standpoint, you touch on like the culture within the organization, but also from a personal standpoint, that can impact folks as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, why do people fail to recognize this unethical behavior in themselves or their teams? I mean, is it a lack of awareness or is it something deeper?
I think a lot of it is a lack of awareness, that they don't look at it as an ethical issue. Okay. They look at it as a business issue. So my what I said before about the depreciation expense, said, okay, well, this is just an accounting issue, right? As accountants, we have to make this sort of decision, but it's purely just an accounting issue. People think about it as purely an accounting issue. You say, well, no, this has larger ramifications, because if it turns out that the company is doing something that's misleading investors, well, that now you're negatively affecting the investors or the banks or your customers or that sort of thing. And so what the research has found, my research and some other research, is that once people realize that there's an ethical aspect to a decision, that it triggers something in their mind and say, oh, okay, this is an ethical issue. They're more likely then to make a more ethical decision. If they're framing it solely as a business issue or an accounting issue or something like that, they're less likely then to make what we would consider to be an ethical decision. So I think you get those blind spots. That's where training can really be helpful, so people can recognize that, or the cues from their supervisors, or even the heads of the organizations you referred to, the tone and the tune. That's part of it. I'm sure we'll get into that later. But what are managers saying? Are they saying that this is strictly a business issue, or is it we have to have concern for a wider group? The shareholders, your fellow employees, that sort of thing.
Do you want to earn CPE credit? Take this course of MyCPE 1 to earn free credit. Click the link in the description to get started.
Absolutely, absolutely. While we're touching on this, I want to touch on a concept that you've studied. And you studied the self-concept maintenance theory, something that you have, studied. So can you explain what it is and how does it apply to workplace ethics?
Yeah. So this idea is self-concept maintenance. It's like, okay, everybody has a picture of themselves, okay, how they view themselves, and the idea is that most people want to view themselves as being ethical and moral, following the rules and that sort of thing. And so when they're faced with an ethical dilemma, okay, they come to a situation where they said, okay, I've got two choices. I can make choice A that maybe would be unethical, but it'll get me past this issue, or I make choice B, which is the more ethical path. And then you look at that and say, okay, well, basically, how unethical can I be and still maintain my image that I'm a good, moral, ethical person? Okay. So you maintain that concept. So for some people, they say any deviation from the rules or any deviation from what would seem ethical, they don't want to do it. So they're more likely to say they're going to make an ethical decision earlier. They're not going to cut corners, go against the rules, that sort of thing. Other people might look at it and say, well, you know what? I'm okay with maybe being a little bit more in the gray area. But I'm going to draw the line someplace else, that sort of thing. That's what it is. It's really, where do you draw the line where it says, okay, if I'm on this side of the line, I'm acting morally and I can feel good about myself. If I get to the other side of the line, then then that's too much, and that's going to be too much for me for the self-maintenance concept. And that's where understanding what is an ethical issue and what isn't can be helpful. If you don't view something as ethical, as an ethical issue, that line is going to be further away, so to speak, right? And you're willing to do more things. If you really view it as an ethics issue, then that line is closer, right? You're not going to go over it as far, basically. And it kind of gets at this concept too with fraud. And there's been a lot of research on fraud, where one thing that has to happen for people to commit fraud is they have to be able to rationalize it. They have to be able to say, okay, I'm doing this for a good reason. I'm not doing it because I want to get rich. I'm doing this because my company's in a little bit of trouble and I need to help them get past this rough patch. Or I'm doing this because my child has a tuition bill coming up due and I want to be able to provide for them. So they rationalize the behavior as, it's not that bad. And I think that's similar with the self-maintenance concept.
Yeah, and I guess somewhere there's also a personal motivator. Like, you are at a job and you really need the job, and you don't want to appear that you were not able to solve a problem, so that pressure just builds up.
That you want to be a team player, and everybody agrees this is what we have to do, and if you go against it, you're not going to be seen as part of the team. That's part of the culture of the organization, or and nobody wants to be seen as an outsider.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen it all the way from Enroll all the way to the Lehman Brothers collapse, and day in day out we can see
absolutely.
Like small ethical missteps that are snowballing major violence.
Exactly. Very, very few people wake up in the morning and say, you know what, I'm going to commit fraud today. It's just that it starts small and then it builds, and it gets to the point where it's like, wait a minute, what happened?
I thought this was
I was just maybe being a little bit aggressive with my accounting. Now all of a sudden, I've got the Securities and Exchange Commission interviewing me and that sort of thing.
Yeah. And then we talked about this, and now I think we should shift our focus on the culture part, because I think culture plays a key role here. So let's
Hmm.
start. We often hear about what we talked about, the tone at the top when
Hmm.
it comes to business ethics. But your research also examines the tune in the middle, which is something new
Hmm.
as well. So what is the key difference between these two?
So really what it comes down to is, so historically the focus was on the tone at the top. That okay, that's where the CEO, the chief financial officer, the board of directors, the really top levels of the organization, they set the tone. So the employees will mimic their behavior. So if they're talking about, we've got to make sure we hit the earnings target, no matter what, then that's basically giving a green light to people to maybe cut corners.
Yeah,
Versus, we want to make sure um, we're doing things, we're maintaining our integrity, we're not misleading anybody, that sort of thing. That would say, okay, no, we're not going to do that, right? That's the signal that is sent to the lower level employees. That's historically been the focus.
yeah,
This tone at the top. But then my colleague and I were saying, you know what, not everybody has interactions with the CEO or the CFO or the board of directors.
yeah,
They know who the CEO is, but they're not interacting with them on any sort of daily basis. What
yeah,
who they interact with more on a daily basis is their immediate supervisor.
yeah,
So that's the tune in the middle. That's how we phrase it. That it's your direct boss. Now that it doesn't necessarily have to be the middle of the organization. It's whoever your direct supervisor is. That
right.
person is going to have more of an impact on what you do on a daily basis because you see them day in, day out. You hear what they're saying day in, day out. There's much more of a connection with your immediate supervisor as opposed to the CEO. And there's a decent amount of examples where things like that, where you know frauds happen without the CEO really being involved with it, and it was
Yeah.
more because of those middle manager folks who basically set the tone and the negative tone that led to these frauds.
Yeah, I can certainly remember. I believe it was the Wells Fargo, wherein the executives had to be forced to create a lot of accounts because they had to meet their targets.
Right.
And
Yep.
you know, I mean, like you said, top had no clue about it.
Right. That was yeah. That wasn't the CEO didn't know about that. I mean, you might be able to argue, well, they set the targets, but it's like, but they weren't the ones kind of directing that. And
Absolutely.
there was same with J.P. Morgan where they had the London whale doing the trading, and that was a relatively lower level person who was doing that. The higher level executives were didn't know about it. I mean, that's a problem in of itself that they didn't know about it, but we've seen that in a number of cases. There's been some research about accounting frauds where, yes, the CEO is involved in a relatively high percentage of them, but also sometimes it's the next layer down, like the controller, for example, or maybe an accountant within a business unit. So without the knowledge of the CEO, they're committing fraud. So it's like, okay, because they're going to have they're seemingly responsible for there must be something with the culture that they're setting with their work teams.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's also the interpretation, because maybe, the executives are not directly connected to the top brass, and that immediate person from where they get the information is their immediate supervisor. So the
Right.
top brass did something that got interpreted, filtered, and that was interpreted, and that was put down, put down. It's kind of like a Chinese
Yep.
whisper by the time it
Ex- ex- exactly. That's a great way to put it. Yeah, something gets lost in the interpretation. Yep. That's why it's so
goes.
important to reinforce those messages on a consistent basis and to make sure here's what I said. What did you hear? Kind of thing to make sure that there's no
Yeah.
misunderstandings.
Absolutely. I mean, your study also suggests that the tone at the top is more influential than middle management. And I mean, why do you think
Yeah.
that is?
Well, I think part of it might well, first of all, it's for some people it's like doesn't matter what their immediate supervisor says, they're going to be more focused on the top boss in the organization. That I don't know if that maybe that's an artifact of U.S. culture where we focus on the main the boss in the organization. Our study was on people in the U.S., so it'll be interesting for us. We're hoping down the road to look at non-U.S. settings to see maybe if that's going to be a difference. We're not sure, but that would be something we could look at. So I think that was part of it. It might also have been too where, and there's always this limitation when you're doing these sorts of studies. It's like, well, did people really interpret it the way we wanted them to interpret it? It's not, they're not in the moment. So maybe they figured, okay, I should be thinking about what the CEO says. There might have been that as well. But I think it goes back to what I was saying before, where, that's the top boss of the organization. Ultimately, that person is who you want to impress, or make sure that you're following his or her directives. I think that's what came out of it, or the way I would interpret that.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to speak about my experience, I've been, when I started my journey in India, I've been to UK, worked in Africa, and now the United States. And what you're saying, although your study was limited to the United States, I have mostly seen the same tone
Hmm.
in other countries as well. Maybe because
Okay,
maybe it could be an industry thing as well, because
that
I've
could be.
worked,
Yeah, I mean,
but
accountants tend to follow rules. That sort of thing, a hierarchy, that sort of thing. That could be it.
yeah, it could be a global thing from an industry standpoint. But
Right.
I wouldn't deny that I have come across people also talking about that we don't do it that way. I mean, we don't really even need to know what the top brass has to say.
Hmm.
At the end of the day, we just need to please the manager. Whatever the manager has put forward, we got to get it done. As long as you're
Right.
getting that done, you're taken care of. But
Right.
that it's a crazy thing. But then I've also seen issues wherein the tune in the middle, they are the ones who actually prevented the ethical lapses.
Right. Right. Yep.
There was a weak tone at the top, but the tune in the middle was strong, and that's how they prevented ethical lapses. I'm sure you must have come across that in your study as well. So could you just give me an example of this strong tune in the middle preventing an ethical lapse despite a weak tone at the
Yeah.
top?
So I think rather than the example I'm going to give you is not so much that it prevented it, but that it detected it more quickly than it
Yes.
otherwise might have
Yeah.
been. So
I
I
mean,
think
yeah, detecting would be
yeah.
better.
Yeah, so I'm thinking like with WorldCom way back in the late '90s, early 2000, that their fraud that was going on there, where it was the folks in the internal audit department who were able to identify what was going on with the accounting fraud. So it wasn't the top of the top of the organization was the ones who were directing the fraud, the CEO and the CFO, but it was the internal audit staff that was able to really get their hands around what was going on. So and that was more folks in the middle. They weren't going along with it, right? I mean, the top of the organization said we're gonna do this fraud. Obviously, we are doing this fraud, and they wanted to keep it going for their thought was that they could ride it out, that eventually the company would turn around. It almost never works that way. But anyway, so that was the road they were on, and then the head of internal audit, Cynthia Cooper, is like, well, no, we're not going to do that. This isn't right.
Yeah.
And worked very, very diligently to detect it and make it so that people couldn't ignore it anymore. So not necessarily able to stop it from happening, but at least to detect it. So I think that would be a good example of that, where that middle part eventually saved the day, I guess you could call it.
Yeah.
Although I mean the company still ended up being bankrupt, but it was probably better than it could have been, than it would have
Yeah.
been.
I mean, there is what we in accounting, there is a term that we use very often, materiality.
Yep.
And and from an audit, there is a term that is often tossed around called independence. So there is the materiality of how much is this material enough, this decision or whatever you're going to be doing,
Mm-hmm.
is it enough? If it's not, oh, I could probably do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then
And I think that actually gets at something we were talking about earlier, where it's like, well, how do they get involved in these unethical activities without really realizing it? Well, they rely on the lack of materiality. Well, that's not
yeah,
a very that's not material, so we don't have to worry about it. And they put it out of their
yes.
heads. It's an accounting issue as opposed to an ethical issue. And well, I mean, you get a lot of small things by themselves that aren't material. You add them up, and they are material. I think that also could be part of it. So yeah, so we kind of rely on that the idea of materiality, that sometimes gets us into trouble.
Yeah, I mean, every business starts off, they always have some core ethics or some code of conduct and everything. It's always been there. But somewhere down the line, things get diluted. I don't really know how that happens. But if I were to ask you that, what steps can leaders take to ensure that the ethical standards trickle
hmm
down effectively at all the levels of an organization, what would that be?
Access latest and trending CPE courses with my CPE One Unlimited Access subscription. Subscribe now.
So I think first of all, they have to make sure that when they are speaking, writing, whatever they're doing, they're espousing the message that says ethics matter. Like whatever is in that code of conduct or code of ethics, that they say, you know what, we believe in this. We live this on a day-to-day basis. When I say we, the top executives, the board of directors, that sort of thing. So they have to be reinforcing that measure that this is an important thing. This isn't something that, it's a nice thing that we paste on our wall or something like that. This is something that we really believe in. And
Yeah.
then if it turns out that somebody violates that, there has to be consequences for it. Now, that doesn't mean somebody has to be fired or things like that, but there has to be some kind of consequence for violating that. Otherwise, people are going to look at that and say, "Well, this isn't worth the paper that it's printed on." Honestly, right? That it's not very important. So I think that's really really important. Is the top management has to really, really support it. Be out there supporting it. I think also too, having periodic training about
Yes.
what is in the code. So I think I mentioned earlier where a lot of times what happens is people don't even realize what they're doing is unethical. It's like, well, you know what? Maybe we could have some training where people are, asked about certain cases and say, is this more of an ethical issue? Is this more of a business issue, to help them to recognize that there are a lot of things that maybe we think of as accounting issues that are actually ethical issues, and that
Yeah.
then will help when that sort of situation comes up. They're more likely to think about it as an ethical issue and then hopefully behave in a more ethical way. So that kind of training. I mean, I think in most organizations you have training when you first start, but you'd also want to do it on a regular basis because the business environment changes, right?
Yep.
What was an acceptable standard 3 years ago may no longer be. So I think that, that sort of periodic training, maybe it doesn't have to be every year, but at least at some point it's got to, you got to get like a refresher basically. So I
Yeah.
think that's what organizations can do. Make sure that they're espousing it, living it, and then also, keeping it fresh, updating it, the periodic training, and as I said before, too, consequences. If somebody violates it, there's got to be consequences, or else people are not gonna, they're not gonna trust it. They're not gonna believe in it.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess it's all about you kind of like fine tuning the compass and making sure that it's always pointing in the right direction and
Sure,
everybody, even and as an individual, whatever is your moral compass, it's being fine tuned and you're given that constant reminder
sure.
of this is what you are,
What's important, right? What do you believe in? Yep,
Yeah.
yep. Because when push comes to shove, that's what you want to. You want to be able to
Yeah.
fall back on that, so to speak, and have that foundation to
Yeah.
help guide your decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you studied a lot of examples, but I would like to, like bet on your. I mean, like, I would like to ask you to, like share a real world example where ethical misjudgment had severe consequences for an organization.
Well, I think unfortunately there's a lot. There's a lot of them out there. I mentioned before about WorldCom. That was obviously a very very big one where not only did people lose their jobs, okay, but a lot of the folks had their retirement account, their 401k invested in WorldCom stock, and so
Yeah,
when the stock tanked, they not
the
only did
entire.
they lose their job, they've lost their retirement savings.
Wow.
So I think I mean that's a like a double hit. You lose your job and you lose your retirement savings. So that's just a spectacular one, right? Spectacularly large. Health South, kind of a same sort of thing, although they were able to reform in a smaller sense. Excuse me, Enron. That's we a big one. Those three happened right around the same time, late '90s,
Yeah.
early 2000s, and that what led to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Basically, it's interesting if you look at different parts of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, you can say, okay, this part relates to Enron, this part relates to WorldCom, this part relates to Health South, that sort of thing. So I think those are from a little bit older, but then we have more recent ones. I mean, you could say with Bernie Madoff. I mean, that was I mean that went from unethical clearly to illegal. I mean, there was no doubt about that. So there's a lot of things there. We just had the things with the cryptocurrencies and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Lot of examples of where and I guess like I was saying before, we think about people losing their jobs, but then there's also I mentioned the retirement savings or other savings, or they lose their benefits. It also hurts towns because then the business is gone, and then that tax base is lost, and especially like with WorldCom, they were located in just outside Jackson, Mississippi, and that was the main employer in that town, and that drove a lot of the smaller businesses. That business left, and then that could also hurt the smaller businesses. So they have big impacts, big
Yeah.
impacts.
I mean, like I heard this. I'm not going to tell you where, but I'd heard this many years back that nothing is illegal until you get caught. All right. I know it's not a good move to live by, but but when I heard that, and but like as you grow, you see cases, and then you realize, no, this is not a good thing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're going to get a short-term gain, right? There's a short-term gain, but eventually it's gonna be found out. And you're gonna, there was a case. It was somebody from Health South. One of their accounting executives. He had actually left the company prior to anything being discovered, and he still ended up going to jail because when they did the investigation, they realized he had done some stuff before he left, illegal stuff before he left the company. So he wasn't even there when everything sort of blew up, but he still ended up going to jail.
Oh, because he was one of the co-conspirators
Yep.
into. Oh, okay,
Yep.
that's
So retiring from the company doesn't save you.
yeah, absolutely, it doesn't.
Yeah.
I mean, like I'm a firm believer of karma, and karma finally catches up on you, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yep. Might take a little while, but it'll get there.
Absolutely. But we see that in many of the corporate fraud cases that we come across, there is always somebody to blame, and it's mostly many times you've seen it's the mid-level employees that seem to be taking the fall.
Mhm.
Why are we seeing this pattern?
Well, I think part of what I mentioned about the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Part of what that reaction was to try to prevent that, because oftentimes what CEOs were doing is they saying, "Well, I'm not an accountant, right? I didn't know what was going on. I don't understand. I'm not involved in the debits and the credits and that sort of thing. I don't have any training in it. So yeah, it was happening while I was in charge, but I didn't know about it. And because the financial executives didn't tell me, I couldn't do anything about it. So that they pled ignorance. And so I think that's where you were getting, the lower level people, the middle level people. I mean, were taking the fall for it. And so actually part of I mentioned with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act is now there has to be basically the CEO and CFO of the company have to certify that they've read and understand the financial statements, and that there's no basically that they're fairly stated. So there's no longer this case where the CEO can say, "I didn't know," because I'm not an accountant. It's like, well, now you do know, because people you have gone through it, you have certified this sort of thing. So I think that's to try to get to make that less likely to happen. And then I think also too, where what sometimes will happen is, and I think this is a good thing, is those middle level people, they'll plead guilty and agree to testify against the higher ups, because I mean, most of the time the folks I would say doing in the middle level doing the fraud are doing it at the direction of the higher level. Now there are some cases where they've done it on their own,
Yes.
but if not, then I think it's fair from a legal standpoint to have them get that that sort of plea bargain benefit or that sort of thing. But if they don't have that incriminating evidence to share basically with the prosecutors, then they're going to be left kind of holding the bag, so to speak.
Absolutely. No, I mean, you mentioned that, nobody wakes up in the morning and says that today I'm going to be committing fraud. Very rightly said. In fact, for that matter, we as human beings, as we grow, we are taught what is ethical and what is right and what is wrong. We are made to analyze the differences and think on ourselves and make those
Mhm.
fair, you know.
Yeah.
And you know, as every professional in the world, they have a code of ethics, code of conduct, and they are made to go through it. I mean,
Yep.
I mean, many believe that, you know, they will never engage in any unethical behavior. This is especially true when you start off, you're
Hmm.
fresh out and you got that so much of energy and everything. Oh, I'm gonna be, you know, the best and all that. But
Right.
then this thought itself that they will never engage in unethical behavior, you know, what is the biggest misconception about how ethical failures actually happen?
Well, I think we talked a little bit about it before, where it kind of sneaks up on people,
Yeah.
and you know they're confronted with something, um, that maybe out of the blue they weren't expecting it, and then they have to make a decision, and in
Yeah.
that split second kind of thing, they're making this decision. They've got to decide, and if they haven't thought things through, about kind of almost like putting themselves in the person's shoes ahead of time, say, what would I do if I'm confronted with
Yes.
this? Um,
Yeah.
they don't have that ability to really think it to think about it right then and there. And then they end up making a bad decision, and then sometimes they feel locked in. So what we try to do, and from an education standpoint, is to have different vignettes to talk about things in classes, various classes, to say, here are some real cases that happened, and how would you have reacted to this? Um, excuse me, and almost always it's I never would have done that, or that sort of thing. You can't perfectly mimic that sort of pressure, but at least you get them aware of the possibilities. But also too, to let them know that there are resources available for folks, like you mentioned, codes of ethics. Different, the AICPA has one, and the Institute of Management Accountants, and all these organizations have them. But not only that, they also have resources for people to consult if they are faced with an ethical dilemma. Um,
Yeah,
uh,
it's true. It's
to get
true.
like an unbiased third party to talk it through.
Yeah.
And so I think, going back to what you said about, they're confronted with an issue, don't feel like you have to make a decision right away. Like, because if you were going to make a rush decision, more than likely you're going to take the what would seem like the easier way out and just give in, I would call it. You want to be able to step back and kind of think it through, and you know, could be call a friend about it. It could be call one of these, the helpline from your professional organization, but get some sort of unbiased third party to kind of help walk it through. Now, they're not going to be able to make the decision for you,
Yeah.
but just talking it through and say, okay, if all right, here are your two choices. What are the negative effects of this choice? What are the negative effects of this choice? And help walk through that. Like I said, they don't have to make the decision for you, but just be a sounding board to give you an opportunity to collect your own thoughts and figure out, okay, here's what I believe, here's what I want to try to do. So I think it goes back to education. I
Yeah.
mentioned before
Yeah.
about what's an ethical issue and what isn't. I think that from a just person just starting out in the profession, understanding that the different possibilities that
Yeah.
could confront them. Because in school, there's a right. Most of the time, there's a right answer. There's a wrong answer. In practice, there's a much bigger gray area. And so, kind of navigating through those gray areas, helping people, give them the skills to help them. Because I mean, as an educator, you can't tell them about every possible scenario. But if they have
Yeah.
this kind of toolkit where they can apply those tools to any sort of situation, that would be beneficial.
Absolutely. In fact, you talked about, not just teaching them when they start off, but also to have regular training on ethics. And
Mm-hmm.
right, these professional bodies, not only do they teach it, but they also enforce it as a part of their continuing education needs.
Right.
Every
Right.
is that you have to take an ethics when you're being reiterated on what you learned. So you make
Right.
sure. In fact, I'll share you an incident. I was in fact talking to this presenter who was supposed to be developing a program for New Jersey ethics. And, he just happened to randomly show me his presentation, and I saw some terms in it and I was curious about it. Because he talked about the different concepts of ethics. There was deontology,
Mm.
utilitarian,
Yep.
virtue, relativism versus absolutism, and that just got me so intrigued because
Hmm.
it's that you don't really hear about, you know.
Right, right. Yep.
And just kept on going, and then I was like more interested. In fact, when you were talking about it, when you were talking about your study and everything and how people to come across those choices, I was
Hmm.
just curious, has it ever come across wherein you had to probably pitch somebody your idea through that trolley experiment, like the trolley experiment?
Yes. Yep.
So have you used that concept sometimes to
I haven't
explain?
used that personally, but I've heard of it. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, but it's been crazy. It's ethics is it's a term that continues to evolve. Like you said, business environments change. What may
Hmm.
not be acceptable few years back is acceptable today.
Right.
Like when I started off, social media was very nascent, and using social media in your workplace was a big taboo. Or
Right.
even sharing something or just venting it out, it's like you're sharing your personal information or sharing things about the company, confidential things about the company, without
Hmm.
realizing. Today it's a different ball game
Oh,
altogether.
absolutely. Yeah. Yep. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, all the way from Edward Snowden all the way to all the other
Oh
whistleblowers that
gosh.
exist.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
But coming back to the point, so how do we fix this? I mean, we already talked about training. We have talked about having the top management also enforce this from time to time. But
Hmm.
if I were to say, if a manager were to realize that the CEO is setting a weak ethical tone,
Right.
if that situation would happen, because that could happen, that
Sure. Absolutely. Yep.
realize that, oh, this is not the right, it's a very weak ethical tone.
Right.
What could do to counteract it within their team, especially when the team is already there and they are like,
Right. Yeah. Now that's hard. There's no doubt about it. I don't want to make it sound like, oh, do these three steps and that'll fix it. That's a hard one. So what I
yeah,
would say is, um, as the manager, okay, number one, you want to reiterate your values to the what you value to your team members, and say, look,
yes,
here's what the company believes in. Okay, this is the
yes,
company standards. Now, the CEO right now might not be saying things that are consistent with those standards, but here are the company standards, and in our team work area, we're going to abide by those standards. Okay, and try to really reinforce that. Say, just because the CEO, yes, he or she is the head of the company, but they're not really espousing what we really believe in. To try to
yeah,
hammer that point home. That I think that would be first and foremost. So really reiterate what's important.
yes,
And if it's bad enough where it could really damage the company, then it might be incumbent on the manager to that middle level manager maybe to make if the company has a whistleblower hotline or some sort of reporting mechanism to say, hey, and this and if it's a public company, it would find its way to the audit committee of the board of
yeah,
directors to say, hey, we don't, and it more than likely be anonymous. It should be anonymous. That we're
yes,
not comfortable with what's going on here. You know, Somebody at the board level or the audit committee level has to look into this and see what's happening here.
no,
And maybe speak to the CEO or whoever it is
yeah,
about what they're doing, what they're saying, because it could really hurt the company. But I think it goes back to understanding the company's values. Now, it might be a case where, and this would be unfortunate, if if the CEO is espousing the company's values, which could lead to unethical behavior. And in that case, I mean, it may just be a situation where you this is unfortunate, but you have to find another job. You say, look, I can't work in this kind of environment. I just don't feel
yeah,
comfortable, because at the end of the day, you have to be comfortable with what you're doing,
so,
and you're going to be accountable for your actions. I know there was I mentioned about WorldCom before, where there was a fairly middle level accounting person who was actually the one entering journal entries, and this person ended up going to jail for a number of years. Now they were putting in the journal entries that their boss told them to put in, but what the
yeah,
court said was, look, you're an accountant, you understood that these journal entries were wrong, and you did them anyway. Um, And so, I mean, it wasn't nearly as long as the CFO, but still, that person went to jail for basically doing what their boss told them to do. And so my boss told me to do it isn't going to be a a good enough legal defense. So you have to be
Yeah.
comfortable with with yourself. So I think I know this is kind of a roundabout answer, but for what you said about staying with staying with your values, that what you think is important. And then maybe going back to the original question, if one manager feels like, hey, you know what, the CEO, what he or she is asking us to do doesn't seem right, what's your take on it, right? So maybe you get two or three
Yeah.
managers on that level to say, yeah, we agree with you. I'm glad we reached out to each other because I thought I was alone, right? I thought our division was the only one who thinks what the CEO is saying is wrong. Then maybe strength in numbers kind of thing, and maybe be
Yeah.
able to turn it around in some sort of way. If that means there's a new CEO or something happens with the board of directors to kind of get their
Yeah.
attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you rightly said, sometime back that there's always this mechanisms in place, like the whistleblower policy, or
Yes,
if it's a company, then there's an oversight committee and all that out of thing. But
right,
for organizations across the board, all these policies, there's always this fear. There's a culture of fear or micromanagement because of which you know people are not able to follow through. But how can organizations encourage this ethical accountability without creating a culture of fear or micromanagement? I know you mentioned about keeping it anonymous, this feedback mechanism, but
right.
no yeah.
That's a tough one. So I think it goes to where again what I was saying before about accountability, where that if somebody's found to have done something they're not supposed to do, that there's some sort of there's going to be repercussions for them. So if you just let people get away with it, then it's going to continue. There's no doubt about that. So there's
Mhm.
got to be repercussions if folks are found to have violated that, and even if it doesn't, even if it's not to the point where it was illegal. Okay, I mean, if it's illegal, that's a different game. But if it was just something like somebody overstated their expense account, okay, it's
Yeah.
like okay, I mean, it's probably not a legal issue, but it goes against the company policy. There's got to
Yes.
be repercussions for that. Even if it was the CEO, right? There's the CEO has to set. This comes back to what we talked about before. Has to set the tone that
Yeah.
this is here's what's acceptable, here's what isn't, and we expect everybody in the organization, including the boss, to abide by or live by these guidelines, by these rules. So I think
Yep.
that sort of can help set the culture. And then when confronted with an issue, companies have to be able to fall back on that culture. It's sort of like with individuals, you practice these ethical dilemmas so that if something like that comes up, you've got some sort of muscle memory to recall about what to do. Companies have to do the same thing, right? Where if they're confronted with an issue, they have to fall back on their code of conduct or their code of ethics or their values, whatever terminology we want to use, to say here's how we're going to face this decision, and here's how here's what we're going to do in response to that.
Oh, nice, nice. Yeah, that's very well put. That's very well put.
Yep.
And with the workforce today, we got a Gen Zs coming in. So I'm going to be asking you a tough one this time. But if I were to ask you, what is the best advice you would give to the young professionals who are entering the workforce, who want to make ethical decisions, but who what is the best advice that you'd give to them
Yeah.
if who are entering and you would want to make some ethical decisions but feel the pressure to conform? What is the best advice you would give them?
Well, I think a couple different things. I think number one, that they want to find out what kind of resources are available to them
Mhm.
in case they have some sort of dilemma. Because I think what ends up happening a lot of times is people feel isolated when they're confronted with an issue, and they don't feel like they have anybody to turn to get advice or counsel or anything like that. So if your company has some sort of whistleblower help desk, hotline, whatever, find out about it, learn about it. Hopefully you never have to use it, but you
Yeah.
know where to go
Yes.
in case that happens. Also, too, if your profession, like I mentioned, the IMA, the Institute of Management Accountants, there's a hotline basically available for members if they feel like if they have an ethical dilemma. They can call this and get some maybe not advice, but at least somebody to listen to them. So they have another resource. And if there's the AICPA or these other groups have them, learn about those resources so that you've or it could just be a friend, somebody you went to college with. Maybe it's a professor that you really liked and you have a good relationship with them. But you want to have some resources available so that if you're confronted with something, you have some place to turn, that you're not going to feel all by yourself. Because if you're all by yourself, then you've got two kinds of pressure. You've got the pressure from who's ever trying to get you to make this decision, and if you feel isolated, that adds to that pressure. And when you're under pressure, it's going to be hard to make a good decision. So I think understanding the resources that are available is going to be very, very important. And also too, to kind of I alluded to this with the person from WorldCom, trust your gut. That if something doesn't feel right, somebody's asking you to do something that you really don't feel comfortable with, you need to speak up. You need to be your own advocate. It can be scary, but if you know where those resources are, or what those resources are, it can help you come to a better decision. Because at the end of the day, you're going to be accountable for the decision you make.
Absolutely. I mean, you've been researching ethical business ethics for a long time now. It's been many years, but
that's a nice way of saying I'm older. But yes.
No, but I mean, it's okay if you don't have an answer to this, but if I were to ask you that, is there an ethical dilemma that you have encountered in your research that still surprises you?
There is one. Yes, there was one. This was Enron, and this was just so crazy. The company had a business ethics policy that basically, I mean, it laid out what was acceptable, what wasn't, that sort of thing. And on a couple of different occasions, when they were doing their fraud, they suspended that policy to allow them to do a transaction that they wanted to do with their CFO. So I've always thought, you've got an ethics policy in place. When you suspend that, what does that say to people? That we are suspending something called an ethics policy. The fact that people went along with that, and it didn't seem to raise any red flags. It's like, what in the world were people thinking? That it was okay to suspend, and I believe it happened twice, to suspend something called an ethics policy. It's like, what did you think was going to happen? That baffles me. That was from, 24, 25 years ago. But it's like, it just that baffles me. That one baffles me.
Yeah. I mean, I wondered, like, there's a policy in place, and this is the rules that you got to live by. And then one day you are like, it's kind of like that movie Purge, for that one day, no rules apply, and you can just do.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, what good can come of that? I mean, why'd you have it in the first place?
Exactly. No, but we pray that day never comes. We are moving the world is moving in a better direction. There are now, there are forums, communities, internet has opened up to a lot of capabilities. Today, we've got so many tools and resources in place. Well, Andy, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you for sharing your insights on workplace ethics, and
thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Understand the hidden forces. Absolutely. And thank you to our listeners. Be sure to subscribe for future episodes. And remember, you can earn CPE credits for this podcast at mycpe.com/podcast. Until next time, stay ethical, stay curious, and keep innovating in everything you do. Cheers.
Access latest and trending CPE courses with my CPE One Unlimited Access subscription. Subscribe now.